When they drove away, I didn't wave. I couldn't. My hand trembled against the cold window pane, and the lump in my throat refused to move. The sound of the tires rolling over gravel echoed through the stillness of the old countryside, fading into a silence that felt heavier than any goodbye I had ever known. The house they left me in wasn't really a home anymore. The walls, cracked and weary, carried the memory of a man's laughter long gone. The roof sagged in places, and when it rained, the drops found their way through, one by one, landing with tiny, persistent sighs in a metal pot by my bed. My name is Elena Vargas, and this broken little house is where my children decided I should stay. They didn't mean to be cruel, I suppose. They were just tired. Tired of the calls from hospitals, tired of my forgetfulness, tired of being reminded that time doesn't wait for anyone, not even mothers. Still, the sting of their last words hadn't faded. "Mom, it's safer here. There's a neighbor nearby. You'll be fine." Fine. Such a small, sharp word. I watched the dust settle long after their car disappeared. The birds returned to the trees, and the wind rustled through the tall grass like it was whispering to me, asking questions I didn't have the strength to answer. That evening, I lit the old kerosene lamp and sat near the window. The scent of oil and rust filled the air. Across the fence, I could see a faint glow from the house next door, a place I hadn't visited yet. I didn't know then that the man who lived there would soon change everything. His name was Mateo Ruiz. He was quiet, reserved, and carried an air of grief I recognized too well. I would see him sometimes in the mornings, watering his small garden, his gray hair catching the sun in streaks of silver. It wasn't until the third day that he came over. He stood by the fence, his hat in hand, and said softly, "You must be Elena. I'm your neighbor, Mateo. Welcome, though I wish it were under kinder circumstances." His voice was calm, too calm for someone speaking to a stranger. There was something in his tone, though, something that made my chest ache. I smiled politely, though I felt small under his gaze. "Thank you, Mateo. I'm settling in, I guess." He nodded slowly. "That house has seen its years. If you need anything, I'm right here." It was an ordinary exchange, neighborly, polite, but there was a flicker in his eyes when he looked toward my porch. A flicker of recognition. That night, I sat by the lamp again, replaying his words in my head. Something about the way he said welcome lingered. It wasn't just kindness, it was memory. And as the wind brushed against the window, I thought I heard him humming a tune I hadn't heard in decades. A tune my late husband, Javier, used to hum when he fixed the fence outside our old home. The next morning, I woke to the smell of fresh bread. A small loaf sat by the fence, wrapped in cloth with a note, "For your breakfast," from a friend next door. I smiled. For the first time in days. Maybe kindness still existed here, in this forgotten corner of the world. As I tore a small piece and took a bite, my eyes drifted again toward Mateo's home. He was there, sitting on the porch, a coffee cup in hand. When he noticed me looking, he raised it in a silent greeting. And in that moment, a part of me long buried beneath the weight of loneliness stirred again. But something told me his kindness wasn't new. It was familiar. It carried a story I hadn't yet heard. One that would soon make me question everything my children thought they knew about the man they once called father. The following week, the air grew warmer, and the quiet hum of summer began to settle over the valley. I tried to keep myself busy sweeping the porch, tending the small garden, pretending I didn't hear the emptiness echoing inside the house. But every evening, my gaze drifted toward Mateo's place. He was always there, always outside at the same hour, sometimes reading, sometimes staring at the sky like he was waiting for an answer. On the seventh day, he came over again. This time, he brought with him a small wooden box. "I found this while cleaning my shed," he said, setting it gently on my porch railing. "Your husband, Javier, made it years ago. He gave it to me before he left." The world tilted slightly beneath me. "You knew Javier?" I whispered. Mateo's eyes softened. "Knew him? He was my best friend." I blinked, unable to form words. The box between us felt like a bridge to a past I'd tried to seal away. "He never mentioned," I began, but my voice faltered. Mateo smiled faintly. "He wouldn't have. Javier was a man who carried his troubles alone. You remember that, don't you?" I nodded, my throat tightening. Memories of Javier came rushing back, the way he'd smile through exhaustion, how he'd hum that tune while fixing the old roof, how he'd disappear for long hours under the excuse of helping a friend. I never asked which friend. I never thought to. Mateo's presence that day cracked open something deep inside me. We sat on the porch, talking like two people remembering the same dream. He told me how he and Javier had built the fence between our two homes, back when the valley was alive with families and children playing in the fields. He spoke about the years after Javier's death, how he stayed to watch over the land, even as everyone else moved away. "I kept thinking," he said quietly, "that one day you'd come back." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the lamp again, staring at the wooden box. When I finally opened it, a faint smell of cedar escaped. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed by time. It was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable Javier's, firm yet gentle. My breath caught as I unfolded it. "Mateo, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll look after Elena. She won't ask for help, but she'll need it. She'll try to act strong for the children, even when the world falls apart. Tell her she was always enough, even when I couldn't be the man she needed." The words blurred through my tears. I clutched the letter to my chest, shaking as the weight of years pressed down on me. I had spent so long thinking Javier died without leaving a trace of love behind, but here, it was a final whisper through a friend's hands. In the morning, I walked to Mateo's porch. He was already there, sipping his coffee as if he knew I'd come. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes heavy with understanding. "Because it wasn't my place until now. You weren't ready to remember." I wanted to be angry to accuse him of keeping pieces of my husband hidden, but the truth was, his silence had been an act of care. Some truths, I realized, were too fragile to be spoken until the heart was ready to hold them. We sat in quiet again, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of things neither of us could yet say. When I finally spoke, my voice trembled. "He used to tell me he was helping someone build something. I thought it was just a job." Mateo smiled faintly. "It was more than that. We were building a small shelter down by the creek, a place where travelers could rest. Javier wanted to call it La Casa del Sol. He said it should stand as proof that kindness could outlive a man." I let the words wash over me. For a moment, I could almost hear Javier's laughter again, see his hands smoothing the wood, smell the sawdust clinging to his clothes. Then Mateo's gaze shifted toward the road. "Your children," he said quietly, "they don't know who their father really was. They see what he couldn't give, not what he gave up." His words lingered like the echo of a bell. I didn't respond. Maybe because I knew he was right. My children, Isabella and David, had grown distant over the years, their lives filled with city lights and endless ambition. To them, I was a fragile reminder of a life they'd outgrown, and their father was just a shadow of the past. They didn't know how much he had sacrificed for them, how many nights he'd gone hungry so they could eat, how he'd worked himself to exhaustion just to pay for their schooling. And now, standing by the porch of the man who'd known him better than anyone, I realized how much I'd forgotten too. That evening, Matteo invited me for tea. His home was simple wooden shelves, lined with old books, the faint smell of pine and tobacco hanging in the air. A framed photograph on the wall caught my eye. It was of two young men standing by the creek, arms around each other, smiling. Javier and Matteo. They were building the shelter, I said softly. He nodded. The day we finished the roof, he was so proud. We sat across from each other, the silence between us carrying the warmth of old friendship and the ache of shared loss. When I rose to leave, Matteo stopped me. Elena, he said, his voice trembling just slightly. If your children ever come back, let me be the one to tell them who their father really was. I looked at him, unsure how to answer. But deep inside, I knew this man had kept Javier's story alive all these years. Maybe it was time my children learned it too. The days that followed passed quietly, marked only by the rhythm of sunlight and shadow shifting across the valley. Matteo began visiting often, sometimes with small gifts from his garden, sometimes with silence, which oddly comforted me most. We would sit on my porch, watching the wind bend through the fields, and it was in those moments that I began to see life again in the small things. The hum of bees, the creak of old wood, the scent of earth after rain. One afternoon, as the golden light slanted across the hills, Matteo brought something else, a photograph. It was a picture of Javier standing beside a half-finished wooden structure, the shelter he'd built with Matteo. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and there was sawdust in his hair, but his smile, that smile reached his eyes. I hadn't seen that look in years. I found this tucked inside one of my old journals, Matteo said softly. He wanted to send it to you once it was finished, but then he stopped. He didn't need to finish. I already knew how that sentence ended. I brushed my fingers against the photograph, tracing Javier's face like I was trying to memorize it all over again. He looks happy here, I murmured. He was, Matteo said. He talked about you every day, Elena. Said he couldn't have done anything in life without you. My throat ached. He never said that to me. He didn't have to, Matteo replied. He lived it. We sat quietly after that, the only sound the whisper of leaves in the wind. But beneath the stillness, I felt something shifting inside me, a soft release, like forgiveness finding its way home after being lost for too long. That night, as I prepared for bed, I heard a faint knock at the door. Startled, I reached for the lamp and opened it, to find Matteo standing there, holding a small envelope. I almost forgot, he said, a hint of nervousness in his eyes. This belonged to Javier too. He asked me to give it to you if he didn't make it back. The words made the room feel smaller somehow. I took the envelope, my fingers trembling. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping an article about the flood that had taken several lives in the nearby town 2 decades ago. My husband's name was listed among the rescuers. He was there that night? I whispered. Matteo nodded. He saved 3 children from the river. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you to worry? That's how he got sick, Elena. He went into that water for strangers. The breath caught in my chest. I could almost see it, the rain pouring down, the sound of rushing water, Javier's silhouette diving into the flood without hesitation. For years, I had believed he died from exhaustion and bad luck. I hadn't known it was from saving lives. Tears blurred my vision as I looked up at Matteo. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because he asked me not to. He didn't want his death to be a burden you carried. He said love shouldn't come with guilt. I pressed the article against my heart. In that moment, every harsh word I'd spoken in grief, Every night I'd cursed his absence felt like a wound reopening. But alongside the pain came something else, a quiet pride, a warmth that spread through the cracks of my sorrow. My husband had died a good man, and somehow, through all the years in silence, his friend had kept his story safe for me. Over the next few days, Mateo and I began to visit the creek, the same place where he and Javier had built the shelter. The path was overgrown with weeds, but the faint outline of the structure remained, its wooden frame weathered but still standing. When I ran my hand along the old beams, I could almost feel Javier's presence. "I used to think he left us," I said quietly, "that maybe he chose his work over family, but he never really left, did he?" Mateo shook his head. "No, some men stay through what they build, even after they're gone." As we stood there, the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. A gentle wind carried the scent of river water and pine, and for the first time in years, I felt peace settle deep within me. That night, I received a call from Isabella. Her voice was distant, as if she was speaking through layers of guilt. "Mom," she said, "David and I have been talking. We think maybe we shouldn't have left you there alone." I paused, the words heavy with everything left unsaid. "It's all right, sweetheart," I replied softly. "You did what you thought was best." "No, Mom," she insisted, her voice breaking. "We didn't. We were just..." She stopped. "Are you okay there?" I glanced out the window where I could see the faint light from Mateo's porch. "I'm better than I've been in a long time." There was silence on the line. Then Isabella asked, "Who's been helping you?" I hesitated. "A neighbor. His name's Mateo. He knew your father." The pause that followed was long and uncertain. "Dad?" she whispered. "He knew Dad." "Yes," I said, "and he's been telling me things. I never knew things about the kind of man your father really was." Her tone softened. "Mom, I want to come see you." A lump formed in my throat. "You and David both?" "Yes," she said. "We'll drive down this weekend." When the call ended, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the stars. I felt something stirring an old wound closing, a bridge being rebuilt. Maybe it was time my children learned what love had truly looked like, even when they hadn't seen it. Mateo came by later carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea. I told him about the call. He smiled faintly, setting the cups down. "Then it's time, Elena. Time for them to know who their father really was." I nodded, tears glistening in my eyes, and who his friend still is. That night, sleep came easily for the first time in years. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. But I didn't know that the visit from my children would reveal one last secret one that Mateo had kept not out of fear, but out of love. A truth that would change everything they thought they knew about their father and about him. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in the soft hum of crickets and the faraway rumble of an approaching car. I stood by the window, heart fluttering with a mix of nerves and anticipation. Mateo had promised to come by after breakfast, but before he could, I saw the car pulling up the dusty lane, Isabella behind the wheel, David beside her. They stepped out slowly, their faces cautious, uncertain. I couldn't blame them. The last time they were here, their guilt was hidden behind practicality words like safety, peace, better care. Now they looked different, weary, maybe ready. I opened the door before they could knock. "Mom," Isabella said softly. Her eyes darted around the porch at the repaired railing, the potted flowers, the faint scent of baked bread wafting from inside. "You've fixed things up." I smiled faintly. "I've had help." David frowned slightly. "From the neighbor?" Before I could answer, Mateo appeared at the gate. He walked toward us slowly, hat in hand, the morning sun glinting on his silver hair. "Good morning," he said politely, his voice warm but measured. "You must be Isabella and David." My children exchanged glances. "Yes," Isabella replied. "And you are Mateo Ruiz," he said simply. "I was your father's friend." David's posture stiffened. "Our father's friend," he repeated, his tone sharp, defensive the way it always got when something touched a nerve. Mateo didn't react. He looked at him calmly, the way a man looks at the reflection of a memory. "Yes, a good friend. A brother almost." The air between them tightened. Isabella stepped forward. "You knew our father. How? He never mentioned anyone from here." Mateo's eyes softened. "He wouldn't have. Your father didn't speak much about himself. He spoke about you." That simple sentence disarmed her. I could see her expression soften, the anger folding into something smaller, something like confusion. "Come," I said gently, motioning them inside. "Let's talk." We sat in the small kitchen. The sunlight filtered through the curtain, painting warm patterns on the table. Mateo sat across from my children, his weathered hands folded neatly before him. "I was with your father the night he died," he began quietly, "and I've spent the years since keeping a promise he made me swear I'd keep." David crossed his arms. "What promise?" Mateo's eyes flickered toward me, then back to him. "To look after your mother. To remind her that he loved her even when life made him too tired to say it." Isabella lowered her gaze. "He said that?" Mateo nodded. "He did." The room fell silent. Only the ticking of the old wall clock broke the stillness. I placed the folded letter and the newspaper clipping on the table. "These are from your father," I said softly. "Mateo kept them safe all these years." Isabella reached out with trembling fingers, picking up the letter. Her lips parted slightly as she read, and by the time she reached the end, tears had begun to gather. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." David glanced at the article, his jaw tightening. "He saved people?" "Yes," Mateo replied. 3 children. The current that night was merciless. He never hesitated. David pushed the paper away. His voice cracked, caught between shame and disbelief. "And we blamed him all these years. We said he was selfish. We thought he gave up on us." I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. "You didn't know, sweetheart. We were all just trying to survive our grief." Mateo exhaled deeply, his gaze distant. "Javier wasn't perfect, but he loved fiercely, and he gave everything he had for the people he cared about." The morning wore on, filled with quiet conversation stories about the past, about the creek, about the shelter still standing in the woods. Isabella listened, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. David asked questions, one after another, as though he was trying to reconstruct the father he never really knew. When Mateo finally rose to leave, Isabella stopped him. "Wait," she said. "You said you made him a promise to look after Mom. Why now? Why tell us all this now?" Mateo hesitated at the doorway. His expression was solemn but kind. "Because you're ready to hear it, and because I made another promise to tell you something when the time was right." I frowned slightly. "Another promise?" He nodded. "Javier made me swear that if his children ever turned away from their mother, I'd remind them of what she gave up for them." My breath caught. "He told me," Mateo continued, voice steady, "that Elena once sold her wedding jewelry to pay for your education. That she went hungry more nights than you could ever know so you could eat. And that if you ever forgot that, I was to remind you." Isabella covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. David stared at the table, unable to meet my eyes. "I didn't tell you to make you feel guilty," Mateo added softly. I tell you because love, real love, doesn't vanish with age. It lingers in the small things, in the sacrifices we never speak of. The room filled with silence again. But it was different now. Not cold or heavy, but fragile and alive, like something sacred had just been placed in the center of it. Later that evening, we all walked to the creek together. The old shelter still stood, its wooden beams weathered but strong. Mateo placed a hand on one of the posts and smiled faintly. "Your father and I built this," he said. He said it would last longer than either of us. Isabella traced her fingers over the initials carved into the wood, JV and MR. She looked up at Mateo. "You both did this together." He nodded. "Yes, two stubborn men trying to leave something kind behind." David crouched near the water, his reflection rippling with the current. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "I wish we'd known." I stepped closer to Mateo. "Thank you," I whispered, "for keeping all this alive." He smiled gently. "It wasn't a burden, Elena. It was an honor." As the sun dipped low, painting everything in amber light, Isabella turned to me. "Mom, we were wrong to leave you here. We thought you'd be lonely." I looked around at the shelter, at the trees, at Mateo standing beside me. "I was, for a while," I admitted. But sometimes, loneliness teaches us what love truly meant. It brings back what time tried to erase. David's eyes softened. "We'll visit more often, we promise." Mateo chuckled quietly. "You'd better. Your mother makes the best bread I've had in years." The laughter that followed was light and easy, the kind that wraps around old pain and turns it into something almost tender. For the first time in a long while, I saw my children not as the ones who left, but as the ones who had finally come home. Yet, beneath the warmth of that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mateo still carried one more truth, something unspoken that lingered in the gentle way he looked at me when the others weren't watching. Something that tied him not just to my husband's memory, but to my own heart. The next morning began softly, sunlight spilling through the curtains, the smell of coffee wafting through the air, and the distant hum of birds beyond the open window. Isabella and David were still asleep in the guest rooms, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel hollow. It felt lived in again. I stepped onto the porch with my cup in hand. The grass was glistening with dew, and the world seemed to be breathing slowly, peacefully. Mateo was already outside, trimming the wild roses that grew near his fence. He looked up when he heard the creak of my porch floorboards. "Morning, Elena," he called with that easy smile of his. "You're up early." "I always am," I replied. "Old habits." He nodded, setting his shears aside. "Your children stayed?" "Yes," I said, and couldn't help the faint warmth that rose in my chest. They needed to see this place in the daylight, to see what their father left behind. Mateo's eyes softened. "And what you kept alive." I smiled at that, a quiet, grateful smile, then took a step closer to the fence. "Mateo," I said, hesitating a little, "there's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" He paused, his hand tightening slightly around the wooden post. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a deep sigh, he looked up at me, his expression gentler than ever. "There is," he admitted, "but I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it." I frowned, though my heart began to thump softly in my chest. "Ready to hear what?" Mateo looked out toward the horizon where the morning mist still lingered. "It's about the night Javier died." The words sent a tremor through me. Even after all this time, that night felt like a wound that refused to close. I set the cup down slowly. "You told me he went into the flood, that he saved those children." "I did," Mateo said quietly. "And it's true, but there's more." He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. Your husband wasn't alone that night. I was with him. I stared at him, the world narrowing to just the two of us. You? He nodded. I tried to stop him. The current was too strong, and the rain was like a wall, but he wouldn't listen. He told me, if it were my kids in that water, I'd hope someone would jump too. And then he was gone. I pressed a trembling hand to my chest. You were there when he... Yes, Mateo said softly. I pulled him out, but it was too late. He wasn't breathing. His voice faltered. I tried everything, Elena. I carried him myself to the shelter we built, but the storm had already taken too much. I couldn't speak. The image of Javier brave, selfless, lost in the torrent filled my mind. And beside him, his friend, the man who had carried his body home through the storm. Mateo took a step closer. I buried him by the creek the next morning, before the authorities came. He wanted to rest where he built something good. My breath caught. You buried him. He nodded. I told the others later, but I never told you that part. He'd asked me years before that if anything ever happened, he wanted to stay close to the land, close to home. Tears slid down my face before I could stop them. I had mourned Javier in a cold city cemetery, not knowing he was already here, beneath the earth that had carried our years together. He's here, I whispered, my voice shaking. All this time, he's been here. Mateo's eyes glistened too. Every morning, I bring flowers. Sometimes I talk to him. I tell him about you, about how strong you've been, about how your children grew up. The silence between us was heavy with grief and tenderness. I felt both broken and whole, shattered by the truth, yet healed by the care behind it. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked quietly. He sighed. Because I made another promise that night. He made me swear that I wouldn't let you see him like that. He wanted you to remember him alive, not washed away, not broken. I pressed my hands to my face, sobbing softly into the quiet morning air. When I looked up again, Mateo's eyes held the kind of pain only loyalty could carry, the kind that never sought thanks. Later that day, I told Isabella and David everything. We walked together down the path that led to the creek. The grass brushed against our legs, the sound of running water whispering softly through the trees. At the clearing, Mateo stopped and pointed to a cluster of stones arranged neatly beneath a flowering tree. Here, he said, this is where your father rests. Isabella knelt beside the stones, her tears falling freely now. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's peaceful. David crouched beside her, his voice trembling. We didn't know he was here all along. We thought he was gone, but he never really left. I reached out, resting a hand on each of their shoulders. He's been with us every step of the way, I said softly. We just forgot to listen. Mateo stood a few feet away, watching quietly. I turned to him and said, You kept him alive for all of us, Mateo. You kept his memory breathing. He shook his head. No, Elena, you did that. I just made sure it found its way back to you. The four of us stood there for a long time, the breeze weaving through the trees, the sound of the creek singing like a lullaby for a story finally finished. But as the sun dipped behind the hills, I caught a faint look in Mateo's eyes, a softness, a sadness, and something more. Something that spoke of years spent in quiet devotion. And though he didn't say it, I understood. He hadn't just kept Javier's promise, he'd kept his own heart buried here too. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, I found myself standing by the window again, looking toward Mateo's house. The lamp in his room was still on. He sat by his desk, writing something, perhaps a letter, Perhaps just thoughts he'd carried too long. For a brief moment, he looked up and saw me. He smiled that same gentle, unspoken smile that had carried me through all these days. And I smiled back, my heart full of something both old and new. Grief and gratitude, love and remembrance, the past, still alive in the quiet hum of the present. The morning after that visit to the creek, everything felt different, not lighter exactly, but steadier, as though the house itself had exhaled a sigh of peace it had been holding for decades. Isabella and David helped me make breakfast, and for once, laughter filled the kitchen again. Isabella hummed softly as she mixed the dough while David teased her for burning the toast, and I stood by the stove, watching them like I used to when they were small, bickering, smiling, alive. I caught myself thinking that if Javier could see us now, he'd smile too. He'd probably tease Isabella for the flower on her nose and give David that proud, knowing pat on the back. When we sat down to eat, Isabella reached for my hand. "Mom," she said quietly, "thank you for telling us the truth, for showing us who he really was." I squeezed her fingers gently. "It wasn't me, it was Mateo. He's the one who kept your father's memory alive." David nodded, his voice low but firm. "Then he deserves to be part of this family too." Those words lingered in my chest long after breakfast ended. That afternoon, Mateo stopped by to return a book he'd borrowed, but before I could thank him again for everything, Isabella invited him in. "Come have tea with us," she said warmly. "Please, we'd like that." He hesitated for a moment. Humility was woven into every line of his face, but then he nodded. "All right, tea sounds good." We sat around the living room, sunlight spilling through the window and casting gold on the old furniture. It felt almost like time itself had softened, allowing the past and present to meet in harmony. David asked him about his life where he'd grown up, how he'd met my husband. Mateo told stories I'd never heard before, how he and Javier had once built a raft out of scrap wood to cross the river, how they'd spent a whole night under the stars talking about dreams they couldn't afford but still believed in. He used to say, Mateo recalled with a faint smile, "We don't get to choose how long we live, but we can choose what stays after we're gone." The room fell quiet after that. Isabella looked up from her cup. "And you stayed to keep his promise." Mateo nodded slowly. "A promise is only as good as the heart that holds it. Your father was my brother in everything but blood. I couldn't abandon his memory." David looked at him, then really looked at him, with an expression that carried gratitude and something like respect. "You did more than keep a promise," he said quietly. "You carried a family." Mateo's eyes softened. "No, son. I just waited for you to come back to her." Later that evening, when my children went to town to fetch a few supplies, Mateo lingered behind. The sun had begun to sink, painting the fields in soft shades of orange and lavender. We stood on the porch together, watching the light fade behind the hills. He broke the silence first. "You've raised good children, Elena, even if they lost their way for a bit." I smiled faintly. "They're trying. Sometimes that's all any of us can do." He nodded, his hands resting on the railing. "They remind me of Javier Strong-willed, a little stubborn, but with hearts that mean well." A quiet laugh escaped me. "You sound like him when you say things like that." He looked down, almost shyly. Maybe he rubbed off on me more than I realized. The air between us was calm, but full the kind of silence that carries emotion too deep for words. I wanted to thank him again, but something in his expression told me he already knew. Then softly he said, "There's one more thing I've been meaning to tell you." I turned toward him. "What is it?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "Javier wasn't just my friend, Elena. He was like a brother. And in a way, he made me part of your family long before I ever dared to think of it that way. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He took a slow breath. After he died, I stayed because I couldn't bear to leave everything that reminded me of him, this land, this house, you. At first, I thought it was just duty, but over the years, it became something else. My heart began to beat faster. Matteo. He looked down, his voice gentle, almost reverent. You don't owe me anything, Elena, but I need you to know. I never stayed out of pity. I stayed because this place and everything tied to it became home. Because you did. The wind rustled softly through the trees. I felt the warmth rise in my chest, not the heat of surprise, but the quiet glow of understanding. I think, I said slowly, that Javier would have wanted that. Matteo's eyes glistened as he nodded. I think so too. He'd want you to have peace, to have someone beside you who remembers not just the pain, but the love. I swallowed hard, emotion tightening my throat. You've already given me that, Matteo, more than you know. He smiled that same tender smile that always seemed to carry a whole story behind it, and then turned his gaze back toward the horizon. Then maybe that's enough. When Isabella and David returned later that evening, they found us sitting together on the porch, 2 cups of tea between us and the sun melting into the hills. David grinned. Looks like you two are getting along. Matteo chuckled softly. We always have. Isabella leaned against the railing, her expression thoughtful. You know, Mom, she said, when Dad died, I think you lost not just a husband, but a friend. Maybe this is life's way of giving one back. I met Matteo's gaze. Maybe it is. The moment hung there, delicate, real, unspoken, before dissolving into quiet laughter and the easy rhythm of evening conversation. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had unfolded, the grief, the truths, the rediscovered love that had been waiting just beyond the fence all along. And for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't dream of what I'd lost. I dreamt of what still remained. The next few days unfolded like a gentle rhythm, quiet and ordinary in all the ways that used to scare me, yet now I found peace in them. The sound of the kettle whistling, the smell of Matteo's roses drifting over the fence, the laughter of Isabella and David echoing from the yard, every small detail felt like proof that life still had softness left in it. I spent my mornings in the garden, my afternoons baking or sitting by the window writing letters I never planned to send. Matteo often joined me in those hours, fixing a broken chair, mending a fence, or simply sitting with his cup of coffee while we shared the kind of conversations that didn't need to lead anywhere. It was strange how easy it became to talk to him, how silence around him didn't ache anymore. One afternoon, as we sat beneath the shade of the fig tree, I asked softly, "Do you ever regret staying here all these years, Matteo? You could have gone anywhere, started over." He smiled faintly. Maybe, but starting over isn't always about leaving. Sometimes it's about staying until something broken becomes whole again. I turned to look at him. You mean me? He shook his head gently. No, Elena, I mean both of us. Later that day, my children announced they'd be leaving in the morning. Not for good, they promised, but to take care of things back in the city. Isabella wanted to visit again soon, and David said he might even come for the harvest next month. Mom, Isabella said as she hugged me tightly that night, you're not alone anymore. You have Matteo. And us, really, this time. I smiled, brushing her hair back from her face. I know, sweetheart. Go live your lives. Don't worry about me. But as they drove away the next morning, that old ache returned, soft and familiar. Not the kind of loneliness that breaks you, but the kind that humbles you. Mateo must have sensed it, because later that day, he appeared at my porch again, holding 2 fishing rods and a small picnic basket. "Come on," he said, his tone light but eyes warm. "You've been cooped up too long. Let's go to the river." Javier used to say it's impossible to be sad near running water. I chuckled softly. "You're using my husband's words against me now?" "Borrowing them," he said with a grin. "With permission, I hope." The path to the river was shaded and green, the sound of cicadas humming in the trees. We walked slowly, our steps unhurried, our conversation drifting between stories of the past and the small details of the present. By the time we reached the water, the sun had dipped low, painting everything in gold. Mateo laid out a blanket, handed me a sandwich, and said, "I can't promise we'll catch anything, but I can promise the peace will be worth it." He was right. The river's surface shimmered in the light, and for a long while neither of us spoke. We just listened to the wind, of the birds, the gentle pull of the current. Then Mateo broke the quiet. "Elena, do you ever think about what comes next?" I looked at him curiously. "You mean in life?" He nodded. "Yes, after all the years, the losses, the waiting. What's left?" I thought for a long time before answering. I think what's left is gratitude for the moments that stayed, for the people who did, too. He smiled softly. "Then you've already found what most people spend their whole lives searching for." I looked at him then. Really looked the lines of age, the kindness in his eyes, the quiet strength that had carried both my husband's memory and my family's healing. "And what about you, Mateo?" I asked. "What's left for you?" He turned toward the river. "Maybe just this sitting here beside someone who remembers him like I do, someone who still sees beauty in what time didn't take away." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. Without thinking, I reached for his hand. He didn't move at first, just let me hold it rough, steady, familiar. Then, gently, he closed his fingers around mine. No words. Just that small, silent promise between 2 people who had learned that love, in its truest form, doesn't need to begin again. It just finds new ways to stay. As the sun sank behind the hills, we packed up in quiet harmony. The air smelled of pine and earth, and when we started back, the fireflies began to appear, flickering like tiny lanterns guiding our way home. Halfway down the path, I stopped. "Mateo," I said softly, "thank you. For everything, for keeping his story alive, for keeping me alive through it." He looked at me with eyes that carried decades of understanding. "You don't owe me thanks, Elena. What we do for the people we love isn't duty. It's devotion." I smiled through the tears that had begun to gather. "And yet, it feels like both." He chuckled. "That's what makes it real." When we reached the house, he walked me to the porch. For a moment, we just stood there, listening to the quiet hum of night. "Good night, Mateo," I said softly. "Good night, Elena." But as he turned to leave, something inside me shifted. I called after him, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mateo, maybe stay a while longer?" He paused, turned back, and nodded. So we sat there, 2 cups of tea, 1 flickering lamp, and the slow rhythm of crickets outside. The night wrapped around us like an old memory finding peace at last, and as I looked toward the stars, I realized something I hadn't before. Sometimes love doesn't come to replace what was lost. Sometimes it arrives to honor it. The days began to fold into one another after that evening, by the river soft, unhurried, like pages in a book you don't want to finish. Mateo and I fell into a quiet rhythm of companionship that asked for nothing but presence. Every morning, he'd appear at the fence, holding 2 mugs of coffee, 1 for me. We didn't need many words, Sometimes we'd just sit and listen to the rustle of wind through the fig tree, the distant murmur of the river, or the soft clinking of the metal wind chime Javier once hung on our porch. It was peace. Not the kind that erases sadness, but the kind that lets you live beside it without fear. One afternoon, as I was sweeping the porch, I saw Mateo standing by the fence again, holding a bundle of flowers, wild daisies, their stems still damp from the soil. "For the table," he said, handing them over. "They reminded me of the ones Javier used to pick for you." I laughed softly, the memory blooming as vividly as the flowers in my hand. He'd come back from work covered in dirt, holding a bunch just like this. Said they were more honest than anything from a florist. Mateo smiled faintly. He was right. Beauty doesn't need to be perfect. I looked up at him, warmth rising in my chest. Neither do we. For a long moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with everything we didn't need to say. It wasn't romance that lived there. Not exactly. It was something deeper. A quiet recognition, a shared belonging. That evening, as twilight settled over the valley, Isabella called. Her voice was lighter than before. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking. Maybe next month, David and I could come down for a few days, help you fix up the old shed, maybe repaint the kitchen." I smiled. "That would be lovely, dear." "And," she added shyly, "maybe you could tell us more stories about Dad. The ones we didn't listen to before." I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I'd like that very much. After we hung up, I sat on the porch watching the stars blink awake one by one. Mateo joined me, carrying a small wooden box, the same one Javier had once left him. "I found something," he said softly, opening it. Inside was an old photograph, creased at the edges. It was of Javier and me on our wedding day, standing in front of this very house when the paint was still fresh and the roof still proud. "You kept this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Mateo nodded. "He gave it to me the day after you married. Said I should keep it safe in case time ever made you forget how loved you were." I stared at the photograph at my younger self, eyes bright with hope, and at Javier's hand, holding mine, steady and certain. Time hadn't been kind to either of us, but in that photo, it felt like we still belonged to something eternal. "Do you ever feel," I asked quietly, "that the people we lose never really leave? That they just move into the spaces between our days?" Mateo looked at the photo, then at me. "Every day, Elena, especially when I look at you." The words hung there, simple, unadorned, and true. I didn't answer. I just reached for his hand, and in that small gesture, every word left unsaid over the years seemed to find its place. In the days that followed, Mateo and I visited the creek more often. We cleared the weeds from around the old shelter, sanded the wood, and rebuilt what time had worn away. He said he wanted it to stand strong again, just as Javier had intended. "Let's finish what they started," I told him one morning, handing him a hammer. He smiled. "You sound like Javier when you say that." It took us nearly 2 weeks slow work between cups of tea and pauses for memory. When we finally stepped back to see it complete, the shelter gleamed under the sunlight, humble but proud. Mateo carved something new into the wood just below the old initials, JV and MR, and the hands that remembered them. I traced the words with my fingers, my throat tight with emotion. "It's perfect," I whispered. "It's ours," he said simply. We placed a small bench inside the shelter and sat down. The river's murmur filled the quiet, and I realized something profound. I wasn't living among ghosts anymore. I was living among guardians of love, of memory, of promises kept. That night, when I returned home, I wrote a letter to my children. Not the kind of letter that asked for forgiveness or gave advice, just a story. I wrote about their father, about his courage, his laughter, his faults, and his sacrifices. About the friend who never let his name fade from the air. And at the end, I wrote, "Your father's greatest gift was love that outlived him, and his friend's greatest gift was loyalty that carried it home." I sealed the envelope and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Someday they would find it, but not yet. Some truths, like seeds, need time to bloom. When I looked outside, I saw Mateo's light still on. I smiled, knowing that even if tomorrow came differently, I would not face it alone. For the first time in years, I slept without dreams, only peace. The morning after we finished the shelter, I woke to the sound of rain, soft, steady, almost musical. It fell against the roof like a lullaby, and for the first time in many years, I didn't fear the leaks or the damp. I simply lay there listening, feeling as though the world was washing itself clean. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of wet soil. Mateo was already by the fence, his hat tilted low, rain dripping from the brim. "You're going to catch a cold," I called out, wrapping my shawl tighter around my shoulders. He looked up, smiling. "I've been catching rain instead," he said. "It feels good today." I laughed softly. "You sound like Javier." "That's because he taught me everything I know about bad weather and stubborn hearts," he replied, grinning. I walked toward him, umbrella in hand, and together we stood watching the valley blur under the silver mist. The creek below had swelled again, its current strong but steady. And even as the rain fell harder, there was something comforting about it, like the sky itself was blessing the land where so much love had lived and endured. Later, when the rain eased, we walked down the path to the shelter again. The air was cool, the trees dripping with droplets that sparkled in the faint sunlight. As we approached, I noticed something new, a small bouquet of lilies placed on the step, tied with a ribbon. "Did you bring those?" I asked. Mateo shook his head. "No, maybe your children came by early." But there were no footprints in the wet earth. Only the flowers, fresh and pure, as if they'd been placed there by unseen hands. We stood quietly for a while, the sound of the river whispering beside us. Mateo bent down, picked up the ribbon, and smiled faintly. "Maybe it's from him," he said softly, his voice almost reverent. "A sign." I didn't laugh. I didn't question it either, because something inside me believed him. The rain had always felt like Javier's way of speaking, gentle, persistent, never gone. And standing there beside the man who had carried his memory through years of silence, I felt an invisible thread connecting all three of us, not broken, just stretched across time. That afternoon, we returned home, soaked but smiling. Mateo stayed for lunch, though we both knew neither of us cared much about the food. It was the company that mattered. Between spoonfuls of soup, he asked, "Elena, do you ever think about what Javier would say if he could see all this now?" I looked up, my heart warming at the thought. He'd probably tell us both to stop worrying so much. Mateo chuckled. "And to fix that leaky window in your kitchen?" I laughed, shaking my head. He would. He never could stand unfinished things. Except his own story. Mateo said quietly. That made me pause. "Maybe," I whispered, "but I think we've finished it for him now." He looked at me for a long moment, that deep, knowing gaze that always felt like it saw straight through the years. Then he nodded. "Yes, I think we have." As evening came, I walked out to the porch again. The clouds had cleared and the valley glowed gold in the fading light. Mateo had gone home to rest, but his presence lingered in the air, in the repaired fence, the mended porch swing, the smell of his pipe smoke drifting faintly from next door. I sat down with my journal, something I hadn't opened in years, and began to write. Not for anyone to read, not even for my children, but for myself. I wrote about the love I once thought had ended, and the friendship that proved it never did. I wrote about grief that changed shape but never truly left. About loyalty that lived quietly, asking for nothing, giving everything. And when I finished, I ended the page with one line that seemed to sum up everything. Sometimes love doesn't vanish, it just changes its face and waits for us to recognize it again. That night, as I prepared for bed, there was a soft knock at the door. When I opened it, Mateo stood there holding a lantern. "I saw your light on," he said gently. "Thought I'd make sure you were all right." "I was just writing," I replied, smiling. "You don't have to check on me every night." "I know," he said, his eyes kind, "but it's become a habit I'm not ready to break." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I was thinking tomorrow maybe we could visit the town. The market's open again. I could use a hand picking new seeds for the garden." "I'd like that," I said softly. He smiled. "Then it's settled." As he turned to leave, I said his name. He looked back, and before I could stop myself, I said, "Thank you for staying." He tilted his head, that small, gentle smile returning. "I didn't stay for thanks, Elena. I stayed because home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person." And with that, he walked back through the dark, his lantern bobbing like a star between our two houses. I watched until the light disappeared, and for the first time, I didn't feel the ache of absence, just warmth. That night, I dreamed of the creek again, only this time. Javier wasn't in the water. He was sitting on the bench we'd built, smiling beneath the shade of the tree. Mateo stood beside him, and both of them looked at me with the same calm expression, as if to say, "You can rest now. We're both still here." When I woke, the first light of dawn filled the room. I sat up, touched the edge of the window, and whispered, "I know." The next morning arrived with the kind of calm that only comes after rain. The air crisp, the earth damp and fragrant, and the sky a soft shade of gold. I made coffee, humming quietly to myself, and for once, the silence in the house didn't feel hollow. It felt sacred. When I stepped outside, I found Mateo already waiting by the fence, as if he'd been there long before I woke. He held a small woven basket filled with freshly picked apples. "For our trip to the market," he said with a smile, "can't go visiting empty-handed." I smiled back. "You could never arrive empty-handed, Mateo. You bring peace wherever you go." He chuckled, brushing off the compliment. "Peace and a bad back, maybe." We shared a laugh, then began our slow walk toward town. The road wound through fields still wet with dew, and every few steps Mateo would stop to point out something: a bird's nest tucked in a branch, a cluster of mushrooms by a fallen log, a patch of lavender I'd somehow never noticed before. "You always see the small things," I said, admiring the way he looked at the world. He shrugged lightly. "The small things are what stay with us when the big ones fade." I thought about that for a while. He was right. It wasn't the grand gestures that stayed in my heart, but the tiny, almost invisible ones. Javier's whistle while mending the fence, the way he brushed flour off my cheek when I baked, the way Mateo now said my name softly, as though it had weight and meaning again. The town was small, quiet, familiar in a comforting way. We greeted a few old faces, visited the market stalls, and picked up seeds: basil, mint, and wildflowers. Mateo insisted I choose one packet just for myself. "Something that will bloom where the light hits your porch," he said. I chose marigolds. "They remind me of the sun," I said. "They remind me of you," he replied without hesitation. I felt warmth rise to my cheeks, and though I didn't answer, my heart did, quietly, with a gentle flutter that felt almost youthful again. Afterward, we sat by the fountain in the town square, sharing a small pastry. The children running nearby laughed freely, and I found myself smiling just watching them. Mateo glanced at me. "You're thinking of your own, aren't you?" "Always," I said softly. "But it's different now. The ache isn't sharp anymore. It's like music that plays softly in the background. You hear it, but it doesn't hurt." He nodded. "That's how healing sounds." On our way back, the sky began to darken again, the promise of another light rain hanging in the air. Mateo walked a little slower, his steps thoughtful. "Elena," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking about something lately." I looked at him. "About what?" He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. "About what happens when I'm not around anymore." I stopped walking. "Don't say that." He smiled faintly, his tone calm. "We're both getting older. It's not something to fear, just something to prepare for. I've been writing letters for Isabella, for David, even one for you." My throat tightened. "Letters?" "Yes," he said, meeting my gaze. "Not to say goodbye, but to make sure the stories don't fade. Javier's, yours, mine. The things people forget when they only remember the ending." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "You always think ahead." He chuckled softly. "I just don't want to leave anything unfinished." We began walking again, the road bending toward home. After a moment, I said quietly, "Then promise me one thing, Mateo." "Anything." "Promise me you'll let me finish your story too, if it ever comes to that." He stopped, turning to face me fully. "That's a heavy promise, Elena." I smiled through the tears I refused to let fall. "So was yours, and you kept it." For a long moment we stood there in silence, the sound of the wind brushing through the tall grass around us. Then he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." By the time we reached home, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Mateo helped me carry the basket inside, then lingered by the doorway, his hat in hand. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" I asked. He smiled gently. "I'd love to, but I promised my knees I'd give them a rest tonight." I laughed softly. "All right, but only if you promise to come tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he said. "Always tomorrow." And with that, he stepped back into the rain, waving as he disappeared down the path. That night, I sat by the window, watching the drops slide down the glass. I thought about promises, the ones that began as love, the ones that became friendship, and the ones that carried both. Somewhere beyond the fields, I could see the faint glow of Mateo's lantern through the mist. It flickered now and then, like a heartbeat, steady and warm. I realized then that this was what home truly was: not walls, not memories, not even time. It was the people who kept showing up. And Mateo had been showing up for years. Before I went to bed, I whispered a quiet prayer, not for change, not for time, but for stillness. For moments like these to keep coming, gentle and real. And as the rain whispered against the roof, I thought of the marigold seeds sitting by the window, waiting for morning light. Because even at our age, it's never too late for something new to grow. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming across my bed, warm and golden. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming jasmine, and somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed lazily. The rain had passed, leaving the valley washed clean, alive again. I stepped out onto the porch, expecting to see Mateo by the fence with his usual cup of coffee. But his chair was empty. The mug from yesterday still sat on the railing, a thin layer of rainwater collected inside. It was strange, a small, quiet kind of strange that settled uneasily in the chest. I waited until mid-morning, then walked over to his gate. His house stood still, curtains drawn, no smoke rising from the chimney. I called his name once, softly. Then again, no answer. My heart began to tighten. I hesitated only a moment before letting myself in. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and candle wax. Everything was in its place, the tidy order of a man who lived alone, but kept his world gentle. On the table lay a notebook, a pen, and a folded envelope with my name written across it in his careful handwriting. Elena. The sight of it made my knees weaken. I sat slowly, hands trembling as I opened it. My dear Elena, if you are reading this, I've likely gone to rest before the morning came. Don't be afraid, I've had a good life, and I've spent its final days exactly where I wished to be, beside kindness, beside memory, beside you. There is something I never found the courage to say aloud. You once asked me why I stayed all these years. The truth is simple, it wasn't duty or loyalty or even a promise. It was love. Quiet, steadfast love that never wanted to take anything from you, only to make sure you were never alone again. I know you loved Javier, and I never wanted to step into the space that belonged to him. But I believe he left me here not just to care for you, but to remind you that love, real love, doesn't die. It only changes form. Please don't grieve me. Let the marigolds bloom on your porch. Let laughter fill your home. And when you visit the creek, know that you are standing in the only heaven I ever hoped for. You were my home, Elena Mateo. By the time I reached the last line, the words blurred through tears that would not stop. My breath caught, heavy, trembling, my heart breaking and swelling at the same time. He was gone. But in that moment, I understood he had given me everything he had to give, quietly, completely, without ever asking for anything in return. I don't remember how long I sat there, holding the letter. The light shifted from gold to silver, and somewhere in the distance, the creek whispered softly as if it too had heard the news. When the sun began to lower, I walked down the path toward the place where Javier rested, the same place where Mateo had spent half his life tending flowers, whispering to the wind. And there, beneath the tree, beside Javier's simple wooden marker, was a fresh bouquet of wild daisies. Mateo's final visit. I knelt down, touching the cool earth. You kept your promise. I whispered through my tears. You always did. The wind stirred the leaves gently, brushing against my face like a familiar touch. A week later, the town gathered for Mateo's farewell. It wasn't grand, he wouldn't have wanted that. Just a small group of neighbors, a few kind words, and the hum of crickets rising in the evening air. Isabella and David stood beside me. My daughter held my hand tightly, her eyes red but calm. Mom, she said softly, he loved you. We could see it, even when you couldn't. I nodded, unable to speak. David placed a single marigold on Mateo's resting place. He was family, he said quietly, and he was. That night I returned home alone, but the loneliness didn't feel the same. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of echoes, of laughter, of promises kept, and love given freely. I placed Mateo's letter on the mantel beside Javier's photograph. Two men different, but bound by the same thread of devotion. When I stepped onto the porch, the moonlight spilled over the fields, soft and endless. The marigolds I'd planted had begun to sprout, their green shoots small but steady. I whispered into the stillness, "Thank you, both of you, for teaching me that love never leaves. It just changes the way it stays." And in the distance, as if in answer, a faint breeze stirred the chime above my head, Javier's old wind chime. Still singing after all these years, its melody mingled with the whisper of the river, with the echo of a voice that said, home isn't a place, it's the people who stay, even when they go. That night, I dreamed of the valley not as it was, but as it is now. The shelter rebuilt, the flowers blooming, the porch light warm and golden. And there they were, Javier and Mateo sitting side by side, smiling, waving from the far side of the creek. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because I finally understood everything they had been trying to show me all along. The weeks that followed moved slowly, the kind of slow that doesn't ache, but hums softly, like a heart learning to beat at its own pace again. The valley had settled into autumn, the fields golden, and the air crisp with the scent of change. The marigolds on my porch had bloomed fully by then, bright bursts of orange and gold that caught the sunlight and held it close, just the way Mateo used to describe them. Each morning, I made coffee for two, out of habit. I'd set one cup on the railing next to the empty chair by the fence. The first few days, the sight of that untouched mug made my chest tighten, but gradually it began to feel like part of the rhythm, like a prayer without words. Sometimes I'd talk aloud while watering the flowers, as if he were still standing there, hat in hand, that patient half smile on his face. You were right about the marigolds, I'd say. They do love the light. And though no one answered, the wind would stir softly through the fig tree, carrying the faintest trace of the scent of pine, the scent that always clung to him. It wasn't silence anymore. It was presence. One evening, Isabel and David returned for a visit. The sun had begun to dip low, casting everything in that golden hour glow that makes even sorrow look beautiful. They brought food, laughter, and the kind of stories that fill the quiet spaces of a home with warmth again. After dinner, David went to fix the old porch swing, while Isabella helped me tidy the kitchen. As she dried the last plate, she glanced toward the empty chair outside and asked softly, "Do you still talk to him?" I smiled faintly. "Every day." "Does it help?" I paused, letting the moment breathe. "Yes," I said at last. "It reminds me that love doesn't stop asking to be heard, even when it has no voice left." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I think he'd like that." I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He would? And your father, too." They were both men who believed in quiet things that lasted: promises, kindness, faith in people. Isabella leaned her head on my shoulder. "You're like that too, Mom." I smiled, though my throat tightened. I learned from the best. Later that night, after my children had gone to bed, I sat on the porch once more. The moon hung low, full and soft, spilling light across the valley. From where I sat, I could see both resting places, the tree by the creek where Javier slept, and the field where Mateo now rested. Two lives intertwined by love, loyalty, and time. Two men who had shaped my heart in different ways. One who taught me how to love, and the other who taught me that love can live on. I held their letters in my lap, Javier's final words to Mateo, and Mateo's to me. Both written with the same tenderness, the same quiet strength that had carried me through my loneliest years. I read them again, slowly, letting each word settle like sunlight through an old window. When I finished, I placed them together in a wooden box, the same one Javier had made decades ago, and whispered, "You can rest now, both of you." Then, for the first time since Mateo's passing, I sang. It was the lullaby Javier used to hum when the children were small, the same one I'd heard Mateo humming one evening by the fence. My voice trembled at first, but as the melody floated through the night, something shifted inside me. Not sorrow, not nostalgia, but peace. A few days later, I went to the creek again. The shelter stood strong, the initials carved deep into its frame, JV and MR, and the hands that remembered them. I sat on the bench inside, feeling the warmth of the sun on my hands. I thought of how much had been built here, not just wood and stone, but memory, forgiveness, love. For a long time, I just sat in the quiet, the river singing beside me, the wind playing softly through the trees. Then I reached into my basket, took out a handful of marigold petals, and let them fall into the water. They drifted away slowly, catching the light like golden promises, floating toward whatever waited beyond the bend. "Carry them," I whispered. "Carry them both home." When I returned, the porch light had come on that old bulb that Mateo had insisted on fixing himself, saying, "No home should ever greet the night in darkness." I looked at it and smiled. He was right, as always. That night, before I went to bed, I wrote one last line in my journal, the ending of the story I'd been writing quietly since the day my children left me by that crumbling house. Love doesn't end when life does. It lingers in the fences we mend, in the promises we keep, in the hearts we touch without meaning to. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it finds its way back to us in another pair of hands. I closed the book, set it beside the lamp, and looked out at the porch. The marigolds glowed faintly in the moonlight, the petals swaying as if they knew. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was living in the shadow of what I'd lost. I was living in the light of what remained. Winter arrived quietly that year, not with harsh winds or heavy snow, but with stillness. The valley seemed to pause, wrapped in silver mist each morning, its trees bare but dignified. I found beauty in it, in the way everything seemed to rest, waiting for spring without fear. I spent most mornings by the window, a shawl around my shoulders, watching the fog drift across the hills. The marigolds had withered, their bright petals now curled and dry, but even in their fading, they were beautiful. I didn't remove them. I couldn't. They had done their part, a season of color, a season of remembering. Sometimes I'd still speak aloud, softly, to the air that seemed to listen. "You'd both laugh if you saw me now," I'd say, still making tea for two, still humming that same tune. And I'd imagine them there, Javier sitting with that gentle patience of his, and Mateo, quiet beside him, eyes full of that same steady warmth that never once asked for anything but presence. One afternoon, Isabella called to tell me she'd taken a job closer to home. "I want to visit more often," she said. "I miss the quiet of that valley." "That quiet has a way of finding you," I told her, "even when you leave it behind." She laughed softly. "Like you, Mom?" I smiled. "I suppose I've become part of the landscape now." When the call ended, I looked around the house at the mended railing, the worn kitchen table, the photographs on the wall, and realized how much of my life had been built on the work of loving hands. Javier's, Mateo's, my own. And though time had taken them both, what they left behind wasn't absence. It was continuity. Every nail, every letter, every memory stitched into the fabric of this small, crumbling house until it felt whole again. That evening, I took a walk down to the creek. The air was cold, and my breath came in pale clouds, but I didn't mind. The shelter stood strong beneath the bare branches, its wooden beams darkened by the damp. Inside, I sat on the bench and closed my eyes. I could hear the faint trickle of the water, the wind sighing through the trees, the sounds that had always comforted me. And then, as if carried on that wind, I thought I heard it a familiar tune. Javier's whistle. Soft, distant, followed by the deep, calm hum of another voice, Mateo's. For a moment, it was as if they were both there again, their voices mingling, laughing together the way they must have when they built this place so many years ago. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't born of sorrow. They were gratitude pure, quiet gratitude for the gift of having known love, not once, but twice, and in two different shapes. I whispered into the air, "I'll keep tending the marigolds for you both, as long as I can." The wind moved gently, brushing my cheek, and in that small, wordless way, I felt them answer. When I returned home that night, I left the porch light on, not because I needed it, but because it felt right. Mateo's words echoed softly in my mind. No home should ever greet the night in darkness. The lamp's glow spilled across the old wood and over the marigold pots, turning them golden once more, even in their withered state. I stood there a long time, breathing in the quiet. And then I smiled a slow, peaceful smile and whispered to the night, "Thank you for staying." The wind carried my words away, over the fields, past the creek, up toward the stars. I watched until it disappeared, and then, with the calm that comes only from a heart finally at rest, I closed the door and let the house hold me in its warmth